one of the really important features of the Deccan from, let's say, the beginning of Muslim rule in the region, which was around 1300, and in particular after, thank you, and in particular after the foundation of the Deccan Sultanates in the, let's say, closing years of the 15th century, is the connections to Iran. And these connections were one of the main framework, historiographical framework, through which the Sultanates were identified, processed, and understood in a way that I think is not really fair in, I need some light here. Where is the light here? Cannot see my own comments. Yeah? Oh, great, thank you. So in a way that was not always kind of fair to the circumstances of the Deccan. So what I'm going to do today is introducing this kind of existing historiographical framework that puts the Deccan Sultanate a bit too close to Safavid Iran, and then try to question what is the meaning of this connection, and in particular the Shiite issue of the Deccan Sultanate about this connection. What does it mean for our understanding of the Deccan Sultanates? So let me start with this beautiful painting from the very famous Padşanama, the Windsor Padşanama, that depicts a very good opening point, and that's the Mughal invasion of the Deccan in the 1630s. This is not from, this depicts the conquest of Dharur in Maharashtra in the northern Deccan. So in 1631, the Deccan reached a critical moment in its history. The Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan, who ascended the throne only 3 years before that, embarked on a major campaign into the region. Understanding the graveness of the situation, the Sultan of Golconda, Abdullah Qutb Shah, this chap, delivered the following speech in front of his court in Hyderabad. His court historian, Nizamuddin Ahmad Shirazi, recorded the following words, and this is an abbreviated version of it. Our laudable ancestor, king and conqueror of the kingdoms of Hindustan, lord of the happy conjunction, because we have to push some Sahib Kiran somewhere, with the assistance of the Prophet's pure soul and of the commander of the believers, Ali, appears as Haidar, and with the help of the sacred spirits of the 12 Imams, struck the heads and necks of the leaders of the vile infidels and low-born Hindus in this country with his strength and power of bravery, and with his sword there is just like Zulfiqar. This way he conquered the kingdom. He spread the customs of the nation of Muhammad and the creed of Ali. In this critical moment, the Sultan chose to declare the raison d'etre of the Sultanate around the themes of the spread of Islam, and in particular in its Shiite form. Of course, needless to say, expressed by references to Ali, to Zulfiqar, to the 12 Imams, etc. This is not a rare occurrence in the historiography of the Deccan. Actually, we have quite a lot of references of this kind by historians of the Deccan to Shiism. And similar language was employed not only in this kind of declaration that may have been for internal or domestic consumption in the court, but also in diplomatic relationship between the sultanates, among the sultanates, for example, between Bijapur and Golconda, we see this kind of language, and no less important is in diplomatic correspondence between the Deccan and the Safavids. And in this case, we have another component that adds up. Take, for example, a letter that was sent sometimes in the third quarter of the 16th century, we don't have the year, unfortunately, from Ibrahim Qutb Shah of Golconda. We also don't have any reliable portrait of Ibrahim. We have everything only from his successor, Muhammad Quli, to Tahmasp, who is, we know better how he looked like, So it was somewhere probably in the 1550s or 1560s. Now, this letter opens with a long list of exalted titles to Hamas, including Nawab Khalifate Alahi. And then the letter turns to demonstrate Qutb Shah's commitment to their brethren in Iran. So it starts with this apologetic explanation of past difficulties, why they couldn't have done so, acknowledging the Safavids so far. And then it turns to stating this. Qutb Shah raised the banners of victory with divine help and with the good fortunes of royal benevolence. He made the rows of the enemies who were collected in the knot of the Pleiades dispersed in the manner of Ursa. If anyone can tell me if it's major or minor, I'll be happy. I think that it's just kind of a trope. And anyways, we definitely need some astrological references, otherwise it doesn't count. Now he's in the position to fulfill the obligation of governance to renew old bonds. It is clear to all that no one before us has raised the banner of spreading the Imami creed in these lands. No one before us has spread the sublime khutbah of the Ithna Asharis. Day by day, great effort has been made to strengthen the foundation of this great millat and the rules of this superior shariat. Now, within the context of correspondence between Golconda and the Safavids, it is very clear that for them, or at least for the ruler of Golconda at that time, Ibrahim Qutb Shah, we see basically two sides of, of one coin that is acknowledging that they are Shia rulers and that this Shiism of the rule is always related to some relationship with the Safavids. As a matter of fact, the khutbah of the Safavids appears time and again in these sources. Now, these two things, Shiism and Safavid, or acknowledgement of Safavid kind of suzerainty, became the key feature in much of the historiography discussing this period. And I want to evoke the names of two very, very important Indian historians of the let's say mid to late 20th century. The works I'm quoting now, they were both, by complete coincidence, I guess, published in 1974. So the great historian Harun Khan Sherwani, who worked quite extensively on the Deccan and in particular on Golconda, argues that, and I quote, the relations of the Qutb Shahi monarchy with Iran had been intimate ever since the establishment of the dynasty, but with the intensification of the Shia faith in Iran under the Safavid monarch, these relations had become even closer. The high place which Iran had in the estimation of the king of Tilang Andra, namely Golconda, he refers to geographical name of the region which they were ruling in India, was due entirely to the bonds of faith, as both the monarchs belonged to the Shia faith. The case of Bijapur was not as straightforward. We will discuss this a bit later. Nevertheless, M.A. Naim linked the Sultanate to Iran culturally, linguistically, and even ethnically. He starts with a long discussion of cranial morphology, why the Indians and the Iranians look the same because they have the same skulls, basically. But then he moves to way more serious history. So within this framework, Shiism has been a crucial element. He writes that, and I quote, with the introduction of a Shia religion almost simultaneously in Iran and Bijapur, the rulers of the latter looked at those of the former as a source of inspiration. The Shia practices of Bijapur naturally made it a replica of Persian culture. Naim later emphasizes what he calls the theoretical sovereignty of Safavids over Bijapur, which includes, of course, the khutbah, as well as seeking recognition, patronage, and guidance from the Safavids. Even during the reign of what he calls the devout Sunni, yet tolerant Ibrahim II, Shah Abbas supports the Sultanate as, and I quote, he did not like the extinction of the Shiite kingdoms of the Deccan. I really don't understand how he explains the Shiite kingdoms of the Deccan while talking about what he calls a devout Sunni ruler. But that's exactly demonstrate the problem. We have this kind of idea what it should be, and it doesn't really work. So the historiography that positions the Deccan Sultanates in proximity to the Safavids was only to be expected when we think about the global change at that time and the historiography of the early modern Muslim world as a whole. The emergence of the Sultanates took place more or less in parallel to the Ottomans, not the beginning of the Ottomans, of course, but their rise to major power in the late 15th century, and the Safavids, whose historiography was marked by strong association with Crete. The Ottomans were imagined as the center of Sunni Islam, both by modern historians, but also from the very beginning, from 16th century Ottoman writings. We know it through the works of scholars like Cornel Fleischer. And the Safavids were associated with Shiism. I think that we don't need to say anything about that. Therefore, the Deccan Sultanates, based on their own proclamations, were understood to be Shiite. And being Shiite at that period means being Shiite in the Safavid way. But this does not really explain what the Shiism of the Deccan mean. Can we really assume that the Safavid model can be transferred to the Deccan as is? Now, my intention here is to argue that such assumption is quite problematic due to the specific circumstances of the Deccan. I want to start by outlining very briefly some of the historical developments there, because it will help us understand the political and social setting and how Shiism may or may not work there. So the beginning of Muslim rule in the Deccan was around 1296, beginning of raids from Delhi. From around 1320, we are talking about permanent conquest by the sultans of Delhi, the Tughlaqs. But the rule remained very unstable. The sultans tried various methods to establish or to strengthen their position in the region, including sending Muslim governors from the north, founding mints, even creating a secondary capital city in Daulatabad in northern Maharashtra, forcing people and basically creating a Muslim society, Muslim elite society in these new domains. Nevertheless, by 1347, so about 25 years after the conquest, those Muslim settlers started rebelling and kicked Delhi out of the region, establishing their own political unit known as the Bahmani Sultanate. In the following decades, the sultans remained quite weak due to regional competition and the lack of cohesion among their own roles. From the early 15th century, local Hindu administrators and military men became increasingly incorporated into state service. But even with the increase in the number of Hindus, the Deccan Muslims, as they started identifying themselves, became or remained pivotal to the state. As a matter of fact, they could say what is going to be around, which made some of the sultans a little bit uneasy. So, from the early 15th century, in particular under the Sultan Ahmad I, the Bahmani started to recruit administrators, soldiers, literati, and of course traders in Iran and bringing them. So they sent their own people to recruit people in the harbors of Iran. Some arrived, of course, on their own accord, and ship them to the Deccan to create a counterbalance elite society. Now, those people called themselves foreigners. They call themselves Rariban. Throughout the text, we see that they are consistently using the terms Rariban. And they were not always welcome by the locals because they presented competition. The creation of new elites, of course, did not compete it did not replace all the elites, it just create more competition. So we have, instead of these local Muslim elites, now we have two groups of elites, one known as foreigners, the other one is known as Deccanis, and they fight against one another. Now, towards the end of the 15th century, these tensions just erupted, and the Bahmanese central control collapsed. Instead, some of the provinces were able to establish their own rule, and that's what we call collectively as the Deccan Sultanates. There were actually way more than 5 generals who tried to do that. There are other places that tried to establish their own state but failed. The 5 who succeeded, let's say, until 1550 were Ahmed Nagar, Bijapur, and Golconda as the main 3. Bidar and Berar much more minor. Berar disappeared by 1574. Now, the foreigner-Deccani conflict became the axis around which Deccani historiography was constructed both during that time and in modern historiography. Now, it's not only a political issue. Each group was associated with certain cultural characteristics. The Deccanis were identified with the locality and with the Deccani language, as well as sympathetic to Indic culture and Hindu elites, so with alliance with Hindu elites. On the other side stood the foreigners, who were Persian speakers and associated with the Perso-Islamic culture and trans-regional network. So I think that the historiography really leads to creation of this kind of neat categories. Furthermore, with the historiography imported from the Ottoman Safavid context of you have to be Sunni or Shia at that time, modern historians tended to add this to these categories. The Deccanis are Sunni, the foreigners are Shia. Why they are Shia? Because they come from Iran. So they must be Shia. Now, a central issue that is crucial for India as a whole, and in the Deccan in particular, is of course Sufism. Sufis started flourishing in India already in the 11th century. With the beginning of Muslim rule in the Punjab, we have already the first treatise on Sufism in Persian being written in the Punjab, in Lahore. It's Kashf al-Mahjub by Hujviri. It became such an important political and social feature that we cannot talk about any political formation in the Deccan without Sufism. In the context of the Deccan in particular, important is the Chishti, Hoja Bandanawaz, known better as Gisu Daraz, lived quite long life and is buried, this is his dargah in Gulbarga in northern Karnataka, highly recommended for a visit, by the way, fascinating place, who was very much associated with the Deccanis. He became a very important political player in association with the Deccanis. Now, from the 16th century, we have, again, outside the Deccan, a development of historiography, and I'm following here Catherine Babayan, who suggests that from the 1530s, the Safavids began to promote a Sharia-minded version of Shiism that included, at least in part, rejection of mystical concepts. That was enough for historians of the Deccan to say, okay, Shias and Sufis are not friends, and created another line into our neat division, okay? Now, it's very clear, for example, in the work of the great historian Richard Eaton, in his very important book, The Sufis of Bijapur, that he says there was no migration of Sufis into Bijapur in what he called the Shia period until 1580. But after the Shia period was over, all of a sudden we see an influx of Sufis into the region. So he promoted the idea that as long as we have foreigners and Shias in charge, there will be no Sufis. This is very problematic, and I'll see it in a better. So this neat categorization encounters serious difficulties when we come to discuss the case of Bijapur. The Sultanate emerged around 1590 when Yusuf Adil Shah, a foreigner in Bahmani service, began to steer his autonomous possessions against the central government. Bijapur inherited elite structures from the Bahmanis, including the foreigner Deccani divide, and all this with it. However, the creed of the rulers, unlike their neighbors in Golconda, kept on changing. And that's a very interesting feature about Bijapur that enables us to look, to examine all those assumptions. So Yusuf, the founder, and his successor Ismail were Shia. Malu, we don't know, his rule was very short and very problematic. Ibrahim I was Sunni, Ali Shia, and Ibrahim II Sunni again. Now, if much of the assumptions that were made already by James Mill at the beginning of the 19th century, that the religion of the ruler determines the whole direction and character of a state, with that in mind, there has been the assumption that every change means completely different orientation of the states, that we see radical changes in what's going on in Bijapur. Spoiler, already now, I'm claiming against that. It doesn't make any sense. So I want to demonstrate it by examining the case of Ali I and his nephew and successor, Ibrahim. So Ali, as I said, was a Shiite. The chronicler Muhammad Qasim Firishta reported because of this, his father, Ibrahim I, was reluctant to declare him successor and actually tried to avoid that. Under Ali's rule, state power expanded considerably. Construction projects marked the turning of Bijapur into a major center. However, this Shiism was not resulted in the anticipated exclusions that we assume from that. Hindus continued to serve royal armies, reaching highest ranks, including generals and the auditor general whose name was Dasu Pandit, which means that he was a Brahmin. A very interesting case that we have is dedications on parts of the wall that was newly built under Ali in the city of Bijapur. And we have dedications of different parts who gave the money for this segment of the wall. One of them is by one Pandit Nanji, probably Marathi-speaking Brahmin. Another one, and this is even more interesting, is constructed by one Jagadeva Rao, clearly a Hindu name, that oddly the inscription opens with the formula, and you can read La Fata illa Ali, La Saif illa Zulfiqar. You don't really expect Hindus to dedicate this. And that suggests something about what is this Shiism. It's Shiism, which is very formulaic, and because the ruler, and remember the ruler is called Ali at that time, so it really helps to have these kind of dedications. But Hindus were not excluded from this kind of practice. Sufis, too, were not shunned under Ali I. The chronicler, Rafiuddin Shirazi, not the same Shirazi from the beginning, this is a Bijapuri one, reports on the Sultan's fascinations with both Muslim and Hindu ascetics and the consistent search for their company to the level that the neighbors thought early on that he was mad and invaded his territories to take advantage of his madness. He wasn't. He was a very effective ruler, as a matter of fact. Now, this demonstrates that the long Shiite-Sufi association in the Deccan continued. It never stopped. See, for example, this painting from early 17th century Bijapur. Note that there is a Sufi, it's a Sufi dargah, quite obviously. Note, and Deborah Hatton noted the alams on the left side, just left behind. It's something that kind of questions this great antipathy, these alams. As a matter of fact, even the first two rulers of the dynasty, the Shiite Yusuf and Ismail, were buried in a place called Gogi in association with the resting place of the Sufi Sheikh Chanda Husseini. Now, this is not a Shia thing as much as it's a Bahmani tradition, and the necropolis of the Bahmanis outside Bidar reflects this kind of continuations, that this necropolis is located next to Sufi shrines. Interestingly, Golconda, whose rulers from the beginning to the end were Shia, their necropolis outside Golconda Fort, again, highly recommended to visit next time you're in Hyderabad, is located in association with several Sufi shrines. So we can say that there is no clear division here. Even Ali himself, Ali changed the tradition of being buried in Gogi and moved to the burial grounds to Bijapur itself. Deborah Hutton notes the connection in the organization of the tombs of even Ali himself with several dargahs, and we know that he was personally associated with him. Even Gisu Daraz, the one associated so much with the Deccanis, appears in correspondence between Bijapur and Golconda throughout this period, even alongside the Shia terminology. A third feature I would like to note about Ali is his association of Nujum al-Ulum. This is an astrological encyclopedia in Persian composed sometimes before 1570. Emma Flatt suggests very convincingly that Ali himself composed it. And if not Ali, then someone close to him, but it was presented as if Ali was the composer. It is a very innovative composition that brings together esoteric knowledge from Islamic and Indic traditions in writing and over hundreds of illustrations. One of the manuscripts, the one in Dublin, has more than 800 of them. The work elaborates on ideas of kingship, which includes the Indic concept of Sultan as a universal ruler, Chakravartin. Considering Ali's personal involvement, it cannot be a coincidence. It means that even though he was a Shia and remembered as Shia, even Indic associations were fine by him, and he wanted to promote that. Of course, we have the mirror image with his successor, one of the most fascinating characters in the history of India, Ibrahim Adil Shah II. He adopted the Sunni line, remembered for his contribution to the development of a unique, localized, and hybrid culture constructed around the deliberately ambiguous concept of Nauras that was interpreted at the same time as new coming or new arrival in Persian, but also the 9 rasas, or the 9, let's say, moods of Indic aesthetics, and he played on it all the time. He remembered as the champion of localized culture. Ibrahim composed a very important work called Kitab-e-Nauras, a collection of songs in Deccani written to be sung to classical Indian music. And it is laden with Sanskrit terminology. His verses invoke Sarasvati, a goddess of knowledge and music in Hindu tradition, here depicted sitting on his throne by the way, a Persian painter. So it's a Persian-style depiction of an Hindu goddess on a Muslim throne in Bijapur. It's something very confusing. But at the same time, he invokes Gisu Daraz, the Prophet Muhammad, etc. At the same time, his knowledge of Persian is said to be poor. Famously, the Mughal ambassador to Bijapur, Asad Beg Kazvini, who visited in 1603, reports that Ibrahim spoke very broken Persian. He uses the term shikasta. And when he was excited or got excited and wanted to say something personal, he just switched to Marathi. He couldn't speak Persian. Now, this description really fits the nice categories. 3 minutes. Sure. The description of the Sun, it just fits all the categories that we have seen before. Keelan Overton starts challenging it and saying that the whole court was actually constructed around interesting accommodation of Persianate culture and Persian people. Very famous of these were all those great poets, Zuhuri and Kumi. Zuhuri was mentioned yesterday. Zuhuri's son Zahur, who enjoyed patronage in Bijapur, and of course the two of the greatest historians to have worked in the Deccan, Firishta and Shirazi, whom I have mentioned before. But more than that, we have clear association of Ibrahim with Shia scholars and Shia scholarship. For example, there is a description of a visit of Mir Muhammad Salih from Iran, Ibrahim invited him to participate with him in Tazia, because Ibrahim said, I always mentioned and celebrate or commemorate during the Tazia with the Shia scholar from Iran. The scholar gave him hair of the prophet, and Ibrahim is said, we are not sure, to have put it in this structure called the Jal Mandir in Bijapur, which is in a very visible place. So this kind of demonstrating association with a Shia saint in the public. Now, with all this came this very confusing letter, which will be a very good way to finish. Yeah. This is a letter sent from Ibrahim II to Shah Abbas I. And it goes, the lands of the Deccan form as much a part of Safavid Empire as the provinces of Iraq, Fars, Khorasan, and Azerbaijan. Accordingly, the names of the Safavid monarchs have been recited in the sermon and will continue to be recited in future. Our forefathers were appointed to rule over these territories and protect them by His Majesty's ancestors. So our function is to rule the countries of His Majesty's behalf and defend them against foreign aggression. Now, this is quite confusing because we have someone who is a devout Sunni, so to speak, writing this to the king of Iran. I don't have, unfortunately, time to discuss all the minute details, how to unpack it. Some, of course, historians said that they were very uncomfortable with it, those who follow the lines, and say, oh, but he doesn't mention the imam, so it's not really Shia. I think that the whole assumption that the khutbah means that now we are part of the Safavid state, so we have to follow everything according to the Safavid line, just doesn't work here. As a whole, the sultans of the Deccan followed something which is much more diverse and much more, let's say, polyvocal in a way than Iran. We don't have this kind of imperial imposition of new tastes, new religions, because they couldn't. That's why when we look at Ali and Ibrahim, if you look from the declaration, this is Sunni, this is Shia, so everything might change, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Actually, we see much more continuation, of which the Safavids and the association with the Safavid was political, was important, but was one of several issues working at the same time. This also explains why Ibrahim continues writing to the Safavids, and remember, the association with the Safavids is there mostly to work against the Mughals, and that was the main concern of Bijapur. The Mughals are approaching all the time. So this kind of idea that now we are the Safavids, maybe we will be protected. They were not, by the way. Never materialized anymore. I think that I can stop here. Yeah? Thank you.
In my presentation, I will try to discuss some key issues of Georgian-Iranian interactions in the Safavid period, to be precise, Iranian-Eastern Georgian relations, or Gorgestan relations. The key questions are as follows. Should we consider Gorgestan as an integrated part of the imperial space of the Safavid Iran, or what was the degree of the integration? To answer this question, 3 key periods must be outlined. First, from the creation of the Safavid state up to the period of Shah Abbas. Second, the period of Shah Abbas. And third, post-Shah Abbas epoch, up to the collapse of the Safavid dynasty. To be precise, up to the period when Nader Shah changed the policy towards Eastern Georgia. What was the common thing and difference between these 3 periods? What factors have determined the succession and changes in the Safavid policy toward Georgia? How the bilateral relations were evolved? Eastern Georgia and Iran established relations during the process of the creation of the Safavid state. At this time, once united Georgian kingdom was divided into small kingdoms and principalities. There existed 2 kingdoms in the eastern Georgia, Katli and Kakheti. Here it's Kakheti, it's Katli. In this initial period, Georgians assisted the young Safavid Shah Ismail in strengthening his positions in Iran and in his struggle against Oyunlu. After this period, Shah Ismail started active interference in domestic affairs of Georgian kingdoms and principalities. He sent raiding expeditions into Georgia, but he was too preoccupied with consolidating his hold on power at home to pursue more ambitious undertakings in the Caucasus. But at the end, from the 1518, kings of the eastern Georgia and the Principality of Samtskhe, it's here, officially became vassals of the Safavid dynasty. Georgia's vassals' dependence on Iran was expressed in the following forms. Safavid did not intervene in internal affairs of Georgian kings and principalities, but Georgians were to pay a certain amount of tribute. They were also obliged to provide military assistance to Iran upon request of the Shah. Despite these smooth forms of vassal dependence, Georgian kings and principalities used to try to get rid of even this vassal dependence and sought favorable times. Several revolts took place in Kartli and Kakheti, these two kingdoms. The Kizilbash, in response, the Kizilbashs organized military campaigns against East Georgia. In whole, in the first quarter of the 16th century, despite these military campaigns and some other measures, Iran failed to establish its political domination in Georgia. Shah Ismail's effort to conquer Georgia were mainly frustrated by diplomatic factors. He understood very well that Ottoman Empire was much more powerful in terms of military potential, and Georgia's annexation would cause sharp and extremely negative reaction of Turks. In this respect, it was much easier for Shah Ismail to stay content with only collecting the tax from Georgia and arranging military campaigns in case of disobedience. Therefore, Shah Ismail has never taken efforts to fully integrate East Georgia into the Iranian world. It is worth to note that Tbilisi was already garrisoned by an Iranian military force, as early as Ismail days. But I can stress again that relations between Georgians and Safavids at that time mostly bore features of traditional vassalage. This situation changed during the Shah Tahmasp rule. He arranged 4 campaigns against Georgia in 1554. As a result, the Safavid dynasty's control over Georgia strengthened stage by stage. However, even in this case, it is inappropriate to say that Iran annexed Georgia. During his military campaigns in Georgia, Tahmasp resettled many Georgians, also Armenians and Jews from Georgia, to Persia, and their influential role in the civil administration and army ensured essential reforms in the Safavid society. This policy was continued by Shah Abbas. It may be said that even the prototype of the Ghulam Corps of Shah Abbas was prepared. Shah Tahmasp started resettling village residents from Georgia to Iran for development of agriculture. The royal practice of contracting marriages with Georgian and Circassian women dates from this period as well. The Amasya Treaty of 1555 between Ottoman Empire and Safavid Iran legalized the actual political disintegration of Georgia. Iran strengthened its influence over East Georgia. Starting this period, the domination by the Safavid Iran was expressed in establishing Persian political and social institutions by enthroning Islamized rulers in the kingdom of Kartli and Kakheti. For the purpose of integration of East Georgia into Iran, Tahmasp introduced this practice of using bilingual Georgian-Persian documents to make the Persian language as an official administrative language of Georgia. In this respect, the case of the Georgian prince David deserves attention. He was converted to Islam and became Daud Khan. According to Iskander Munshi, Daud Khan, called as a son by the Shah, he received Tbilisi Vilayet and the region subjected to the Supreme Divan. Davud Khan, or David XI, was the first Georgian royal and was put on the puppet throne in Tbilisi. This event marked the start of almost 250 years of Iranian political dominance, with a few brief intermissions over eastern Georgia. From this time, Safavid rule was mainly exercised through the approval or appointment of Georgian royals of the Bagrationi dynasty, at times converted to Shia Islam, as walis or khans. During the same period, Iranian cultural influence dominated eastern Georgia. Supposedly under the ruling of Davud Khan, Iran carried out the first ever inventory of Tbilisi and Kartli lands and registered these lands into the Divan Daftar of Iran. This signified that Tbilisi and its neighboring locations were announced as the property of the state divan, registered in the list of the Iran state-owned lands. And only after this process, Davud Khan, as an Iranian official, received these lands as an endowment. Besides this, the first Georgian Muslim official, there were soon also introduced positions, characteristics for Iran, Minbash, Kashik, Lala, Malik, Daruga, etc. It should be also noted that in that period, Kakheti and Kartli started minting coins with inscriptions of names of Iranian shahs. In general, it can be said that Tahmasp succeeded in his attempt to fully integrate eastern Georgia, but the first steps in this direction were taken. Shah Abbas continued this policy, but he also added new important details, and these factors enable us to consider the period of Shah Abbas as an essentially new epoch in Georgian-Iranian relations. Shah Abbas was determined to restore Persian predominance in the Caucasus. Although he inflicted enormous devastation on Georgian kingdoms and appointed and dismissed their rulers almost at will, he never succeeded fully in stamping out resistance to his rule. During the Shah Abbas rule, anti-Persian orientation in Kakheti gradually became stronger. This was followed by the Kizilbash military expeditions in Kakheti during 1613, 1617, causing much suffering on the part of the inhabitants. The kingdom lost a considerable part of its population. Some died while others were forced to resettle in Feridun near Isfahan, as well as in Khorasan and Mazandaran. On the other hand, settlements of Turkmens in Kakheti began. The latter were meant to make a stronger base for Iran in Caucasus. While Kakhetians resettled in Iran would be agricultural workers and devoted warriors of Shah. Besides this, as it turns out, the Shah was looking for an appropriated form for cohabitation of local Kakhetian population and newly settled Turkmens. In general, it should be noted that there was not a common policy towards non-Muslim subjects in the empire. Shah Abbas was using different approaches based on historical realities and political expediency. For example, it is known that during his devastating military campaign in Kakheti in 1614, Shah Abbas at the same time carried out several punitive actions against Kizilbash warriors, who expelled Georgians from their houses and persecuted them. Religious figures used to also beg the Shah's negative attitude to the persecutions carried out by Kizilbash warriors in Georgia. The new policy called for settling Kizilbash tribes in Kakheti, first of all resettling Kakheti peasants in Iran. Choose this policy revealed attempt for shaping a certain imperial unity. At the same time, this policy reveals no attempt for Islamizing local Christian population. In this respect, consideration by Shaykh Bahai, one of the mentors of Shah Abbas, about coexistence of Muslims and Christians rise a special interest. He asserts that Muslims are not obliged to impose restrictions on Christians based on religious principles and prevent them from eating pork or drinking wine. Moreover, In the interests of Islam, Muslims were allowed to live side by side with Christians and simulate as if they also eat pork and drink wine. Viewpoints of Baha'i about foods and goods made by Georgian Christians are not dated, but it is not questionable that these instructions were related to the situation shaped after Shah Abbas' military campaigns into Kakheti. Should we think that thanks to the introduction of similar regulation by religious figures, Shah Abbas aspired for deepening social integration of depopulated regions, especially in the locations where Christians constituted the majority anyway? The instructions by Baha'i evidently shows that for him it was necessary to adapt Muslim minority with Christian majority in Georgia and establish peaceful social and economic relations between them. In the end, considerations by Sheikh Baha'i were not accepted, but the policy for Georgia's integration into Iran's imperial world was strengthening. However, even in this case, this policy achieved only partial success. It should be also stressed that Shah Abbas carried out an institutionalization of the practice starting by Shah Tahmasp, calling for employing Islamized Georgians, Armenians, and Circassians in Persian army and civil administration. Naturally, they were obliged to adopt Islam. From the beginning of the rule of Shah Abbas I, the importance of Georgia and the influence of native Georgians and Armenians in the Safavid state increased, and they came to be known as the third force. During the remaining century of Safavid predominance in Georgia, after the death of Shah Abbas in 1629, Persian influence was unprecedented. The kingdom of Kartli was transformed into a province of Persia and regularly paid tribute and sent gifts, peshkesh, to the Shah in the form of boys and girls, horses and wines. The Georgian economy was also closely linked to that of Persia, and Georgian literature was enriched by translations of Persian classics and adaptations of Persian genres. From the 1630s onwards, the so-called politics of compromise or concessions was established between Kartli and Persia. This implied that Persia would leave Kartli's social economic structure unchanged, and the Georgian dynasty of Bagrationis would maintain their royal throne with the condition of adopting Islam and subordinating to the Safavid Shah. The successor of Shah Abbas, Shah Safi, had one undoubted success in the support he gave to a policy of reconciliation and reconstruction in the Christian kingdoms of eastern Georgia, which had been devastated by the brutal campaigns and deportations carried out by Shah Abbas. The new policy was implemented by the Georgian prince Khosrow Mirza, who was prefect Daruga of Isfahan when Shah Abbas died and played an important part in securing Safi's accession. He was descendant of Bagration royal family, illegal son of Daud Khan. He was born and lived in Iran. In 1632, Shah Safi rewarded him the title of Rustam Khan, and sent him to Tbilisi as his viceroy, Wali. Khosrow Mirza became King Rustam for Georgians and Rustam Khan for Iranians. This decision of Shah Safi became a turning point in Iran-Kartli relations. Despite his advanced age of 67, Rustam Khan governed eastern Georgia with wisdom and energy for a quarter of century, dying in 1658 at the age of 92. He defeated those who still opposed Iranian rule and modeled his court and administration on Iranian lines, but at the same time set out to prove that Georgians would remain themselves as part of the Safavid realm. Although a Muslim himself, he saw to it that Christians and Muslims were treated absolutely equally and that Georgia's Christian identity was respected. In Georgian documents, Rustam mentions himself as the king of kings and patron, identically of other Christian kings. And in official documents of Shah of Iran, Rustam is mentioned in the following way: my brother, the Wali of Katli, Rustam Khan. This signifies that Georgians considered Rustam as a king who called himself the vassal of Iran. As to the Shah, he considered Katli as its subordinate territory, and Rustam is considered as a Wali, official ruler subjected to the Shah of Iran. The political harmony lasted up to the decline of the Safavid dynasty. Huge financial resources were contributed to Rustam for improving affairs in Katli, and the Shah had granted wide commissions to him. Under the mentioned policy of concessions, Georgian kings, vassals of the Safavids, could control domestic affairs themselves, despite certain restrictions. Rustam used to restore ruined churches, care for Christian clergy, and on the other hand, he adhered to Muslim rules, built Muslim prayer houses. Rustam married the sister of Levan Dadiani, ruler of Samegrelo Principality, despite she was Christian and divorced, but even in this case, he was obliged to ask the permission of marriage to Shah. Under the ruling of Rustam, the position practiced in Safavid Iran were introduced in Katli to Wazir, Mustawfi, Munshi, etc. All these positions were to protect the Shah's interests in Katli. As a rule, they were appointed by the Shah. It should be also noted that in Georgia's civil administration, the names of Malik and Daruga positions appears in from 1570s. However, the hierarchy of Georgian urban officials remained Georgian, basically. During Iran's political influence in eastern Georgia, besides the Persian language firmans, Hobbes, endowment diplomas, and other similar documents, there were Georgian-Persian documents to bilingual documents, passed by Georgian kings, and this factor were part of the mentioned policy of compromise concessions. Georgian parts of bilingual documents of this period were composed due to the Georgian diplomatic standards. Therefore, when describing domestic feudal relations, they do not differ much from Georgian monolingual documents. At the same time, frequently Georgian and Persian texts appear as independent versions. The Persian diplomatic standards, which were formed in essentially different conditions, did not fit to reflect adequately the Georgian feudal reality. We should also mention the Iranian terminology used for Persian edition of the Georgian part of the bilingual documents. For example, Latin ownership, Sorugal, Texas, Dastandaz, Sarsho Marabachra, etc. In 1654, during the reign of King Shahbaz II, Katli was turned into crown land, Hase, and therefore subjected to direct Safavid taxation. The amount of land directly taxed by the state reached its greatest extent in this year. Also, during Abbas II's reign, an earlier plan was revived to populate Kakheti with Turkic nomads. This measure incited a general uprising in 1659. Rebels succeeded in expelling the nomads, but still had to accept the Safavid king's suzerainty. As noted, under the governance system of Iran, King of Georgia was also a Wali, one of the highest regional positions in the Safavid Iran. This position was inheritable. Wali of Gorgestan was one of the four Walis of Iran. A Wali belonged to the dynasty of successor rulers. Moreover, besides this military assistance, Wali were obliged to send peshkesh and donation to the court of the Shah. Under the Iranian regulations, the duty of Katli's Wali were related to the villages granted by the Shah in exchange for honest and devoted service. These villages had been transmitted to the Katli Wali, not in Katli kingdom immediately, but in the northern provinces of Iran. The Valley of Gorgestan ranked third due to official ranking, but its real condition and importance among major emirs or provinces was very unique and peculiar. As the province was border entity, the valleys of Georgia exercised more autonomy than other provinces of the Safavid Empire. Sometimes it is compared to the Arabistan province, present-day Khuzestan province, in the southwestern part of the empire. According to Jean Chardin, Shahnawaz Vakhtang, the fifth king of Georgia, or Shahnawaz, requests that he be greeted like the king of Persia at the first meeting with him, with Chardin. The Valley of Gorgestan implies the content content of Valley of Katli, not the whole east part of the Georgia, because the kingdom of Katli was considered by the Safavids as extremely important from strategic, political, and economic point of view, from controlling not only East Georgia but the whole Caucasus. For the purpose of controlling the valley and administrative unit, Iranian army was deployed into the country in addition. In this respect, Tbilisi gives an interesting sample. Persian troops stood in Tbilisi fortress. Iranian commandant of Tbilisi fortress had extraordinary rights, and he could even arrest King of Katli in case of appropriate instruction from the Shah of Iran. In 1648, Kakheti was put under the rule of Valley of Katli. He was already titled as the sovereign of both Katli and Kakheti, although this rule was only nominal, since the Iranian officials appointed by the Shah were real governors of the Kakheti. The Persians were positioned in main fortresses of Kakheti. From 1677 to 1703, the members of Georgian royal house of Bagration lost Kakhetian throne and were replaced by the Persian governors. French traveler Tournefort, who visited Georgia and Iran in 71-72, mentions East Georgia as Persian Georgia and adds that King of Georgia, who executes the duties of a ruler, must be Muslim, because the Shah of Persia does not appoint a wali without conversion to Islam. Tournefort also stresses that it was necessary for Georgian kings and nobles to provide guarantees of loyalty to Iran. The king of Persia spends much more finances than gains in Georgia. He says, to use Georgian nobles in his interests who can give preferences to Turks, King of Persia pays huge money to them. King of Persia used to pay 302 months' salary to King of Katli. Georgians and Armenians pay a per capita tax, 6 abbas. It is worth to note that Georgia every 6 months was made to furnish the royal wine cellar with about 20 cases of wine of 10 bottles each bottle containing more than 3 pints or about 1.5 liter. The person officially approved on the throne of Katli or Kakheti was given a high-ranking position at the Shah administration. To this end, for the certain trial period, these persons used to remain in Iran, and this trial period used to last the whole life sometimes. During the trial periods, the ruling duties were imposed on an assistant, janishin. Based on the principle of legitimacy, this was an efficient mechanism. In case of disobedience, a janishin would automatically clash with not only the royal court of Iran, but also the legal owner of the court of Kakheti or Katli. Iran's influence in Gorgestan was expressed in several aspects. According to Jean Chardin, who visited Georgia in 1670-71, houses of nobles and public buildings were built like Persian buildings. Construction works were cheap because Georgian nobles owned huge resources of wooden materials, stone, plaster, and lime. They also acted like Persians in eating, lying, drinking, and sitting. Chardin also notes that Tbilisi was one of the beautiful cities of Persia. But he also adds that besides the city used to obey the Muslim state and the Muslim ruler used to govern Tbilisi and its surrounding territories, Georgians maintained certain freedom. Persians are obliged not to carry out ultimate measures, and they had to grant full rights to Tbilisi and Georgia to maintain all formal signs of their religion. According to Jean Chardin, steeples of all churches have crosses and ringing bells. Pork is sold at public places openly, and wines are made at all crossroads. After Georgians announced obedience to Persia, women are banned to be beside men. But this restriction runs only in towns, because in villages and towns without Muslim presence women do not wear veils, and they absolutely freely meet and talk with men. Presumably, Persians are discontent with all these factors, but they can do nothing. Persians have taken all efforts to build a mosque in Tbilisi, but they could not finish this. Chardin notes that even in Tbilisi fortress, when Persians reject where a Persian garrison stood, local population threw stones to minaret and forced Persians to reject the mosque construction plans. Chardin continues that nobles of Georgia were content with people's revolt, but they expressed opposite moods in public. They rejected Christianity formally to obtain the ruling rights, and they acted contrary to their own will when supporting Islam dissemination. According to Chardin, the majority of Georgian nobles confess Islam only as a mere formality. Some of them convert to this religion to have a position at the royal court and receive a state salary, and some of them convert to Islam to become worthy to give their daughters in marriage to king. During the period of Safavid dominance, Iranian cultural influence was also enormous. A great number of books were translated from Persian into Georgian. Teymuraz I of Kakheti, Tahmuraz Khan, who was fighting practically all his life against Persian, was fluent in Persian and fond of Persian poetry, which he highly valued. In his words, Persian was much more musical language than Georgian. Teymuraz wrote several poems influenced by the contemporary Persian tradition. Iranian influence on the clothes of the Georgian nobility of the 17th century is visible on several frescoes from Georgian Orthodox churches. Georgian miniature painting was also of Persian style. Representatives of Georgian royal dynasty and nobles were also appointed on the highest administrative positions of the Safavid Iran. It was the privilege of Muslim members of the Bagrationi royal family to execute the duties of Isfahan Darura, and this privilege ran for more than 100 years. Chardin writes that the ruler of Georgia do not always execute Persian king's decrees without objection. Chardin submits a very interesting letter that Shahnavaz V sent to the king of Poland. The Georgian king prescribes so many titles to himself that the impression is created that he is the ruler of a huge empire. But after this, he mentions that Shah of Persia with much more epithets. I'll make emphasis on one more interesting aspect from the Chardin's work. The Georgian king shows intention to establish trade relations with Europe. with Europe, and he says to Chardin, if anybody arrives in Georgia for trading, I grant all freedom and privileges to them that they ask. My kingdom borders Black Sea. The Europeans who intend to travel to India through my country will never find better road compared to our country. However, later he sends a letter to Chardin, and its content is given by the French traveler. The ruler has long thought about my offer to send a letter to a French company for developing trade in Georgia and using this country for transit purposes. The ruler shows willingness to persuade the company in the benefits that it can gain from trading in this country. But he abstains anyway, because he is the vassal of the king of Persia, and he is afraid that the king of Persia may misinterpret this business letter to a foreign party without his consent. Starting the 18th century, during the gradual declination of the Safavid dynasty, the situation started changing. East Georgia temporarily gets rid of Iran's influence, but Ottoman Empire and Russia intensify their activities in the region. After the collapse of Safavid dynasty and under the ruling of Nader Shah, a new period started in Iran-East Georgian relations. As a result, Iran's position essentially weakened. So it is not correct to say that for much of the 18th century, Persia generally maintained its position in Georgian affairs. The viceroys asserted their independence whenever the opportunity arose. A decline of Safavid Empire, activities of Ottomans and Russians, and etc. The above-mentioned politics of compromise came to end in 1745 when, with the permission of Nader Shah, Teimuraz II was coronated as a king of Kartli, according to Christian tradition. From 1748, kingdoms of Kartli and Kakheti were practically independent, but the formal side of vassalage was still observed. In 1762, the kingdoms of Kartli and Kakheti were united, but it's already not a topic of my presentation. In conclusion, I would characterize the three periods that I have outlined once again. It's very interesting. Blue mosque constructed in 16th century or 17th century, destroyed during the communist rule in 1951. First, short 16th century vassal relations during the rule of Shah Ismail, and first tips for integration during the rule of Shah Tahmasp. Second, epoch of Shah Abbas, period of seeking reforms of integration and promotion of Georgians in Iran. The settled Georgians were in practice entirely integrated in Iranian society, but we can say the same in relation to the population of eastern Georgia. And the third, period of concessions, or the called era of compromise, the epoch after Shah Abbas up to the collapse of the Safavid Empire, when Iran does not strive for full integration of the region and remains content with partial control of the country through a Muslim king, Wali, his own officials and garrisons deployed to eastern Georgia. Thank you very much.
Safavids and the Uzbeks is my task for the final paper here. The walls of the central banquet hall of the Chehel Sutun Palace Pavilion in Esfahan are decorated with 6 monumental paintings that have intrigued art historians for decades. While 2 of them were added in the Qajar period, there's broad consensus that 4 of them date to the 17th century. 3 of them depict festive and amiable receptions of representatives of eastern neighbors of the Safavids, and 1 represents a very grim battle scene. We're going to see all of them a little later. While one of the reception scenes can be quite safely identified as an encounter between Shah Tahmasp and the exiled Mughal ruler Humayun, the other 3 paintings, including the battle scene, appear to refer to Uzbek Khans. I'll come to the term Uzbek a little later also. Taken together, the wall paintings, The wall paintings of the Chehel Sotun audience hall offer vivid testimony for the significance of Iran's northeastern neighbors for the Safavids in what I call the long 17th century. We just had this short 16th century on George's slides, so we have now the long 17th century. It is remarkable how little attention has been paid to these paintings by historians. Not art historians, but historians. And this despite the fact that Susan Babaoui, who unfortunately cannot be here, is not here today, already in an article published in 1994, framed the paintings, if I may say so, in the political situation and the Eastern interests of the Safavids around the middle of the 17th century, connecting them specifically with the Safavid-Mughal conflicts over the possession of Kandahar around 1650. But before we take a closer look at the paintings and their possible implications, we need to do some groundwork and some homework and sketch the political relations between the Safavids and Uzbeks in order to brevity, with a focus on the long 17th century that began with the Abul Khairat or Uzbek possession of Khorasan in the decade after 1588. This is just, I had to show.
Can you do anything about the lights from there? Or?
I'm not sure, I may. Well, there's a screen, I can do a screen up and down, which is probably not a good idea.
Yeah, don't worry.
No, okay, no. But I think it's maybe later with the paintings, maybe I'll try to. So this is just because I had to show Bukhara, of course, here. Had to be up there very briefly. The Safavids, and so Safavid and Jochid Neo-Genghisids, let's call it this way. Short overview of 2 centuries of troubled relations in a multipolar region. The Safavids and the Chingisid Shaybanids came, thank you, that's brilliant, thank you. Came to power almost simultaneously at the turn of the 16th century. The Shaybanids, led by Muhammad Shaybani Khan, by 1507 took control of Transoxiana and parts of Khorasan. In 1507, they took Herat, the capital of the Timurid Hussein Bey Kara. From then on, the possession of Khorasan was the main bone of contention between Safavids and Uzbeks. In the period between 1524 and 1540, Shah Tahmasp and Sultan Ubaidullah, later Khan Ubaidullah, engaged in what Martin Dixon called the duel for Khorasan. In 1588, taking advantage of the complicated accession of the young Abbas I to the Safavid throne, the Bukharan Khan Abdallah ibn Iskandar took possession of much of northeastern and eastern Iran, including Herat and Mashhad. In 1598, the Safavid Shah Abbas I regained control over Mashhad and Herat, and for most of the 17th century, the region from Herat to the west was Safavid, while eastern Khorasan, so corresponding largely to northern Afghanistan, north of the Hindu Kush and other parts, with its capital Balkh, was Uzbek. Thus, in a way, one could say that after the troublesome 16th century, during the 17th century or the second Safavid century, Safavid-Uzbek relations were relatively stable, and we could leave it at that. You would probably be happy. But no, the Uzbek remained important to the Safavids, and Safavids continue to interact in various ways with their northeastern neighbors. So far, I have said Safavids and Uzbeks, which is the title of the talk. Safavid period sources tend to label the two sides as Qazelbash and Uzbeks, and we sometimes find this even in Central Asian sources, especially in the later period. Thus foregrounding the tribal elites rather than the ruling dynasties, and indirectly also underscoring the Shia-Sunni confessional divide, or a possible confessional divide, whatever. Safavids and Uzbeks, as in the title of the talk, is actually a hybrid expression. Safavids is the dynasty. The Uzbeks is the whatever tribal, whatever you might call that, basis for Neo-Chinggizid rule in Central Asia. In my talk, I will usually prefer more specific designations for the Uzbek side of the equation. So I hope the right slide comes up. Yes. These designations are not as familiar as Safavid or Gezelbash or Uzbek, or perhaps still Shebanids. So please try to remember some of them for the next few minutes, especially the Abul Khairids and the Turay Timurids. We need them. They refer to two branches of descendants through Genghis Khan's oldest son, Jochi, either through Shiban, we have then the Arab Shahids in Khwarezm after 1510, and the Abul Khairids, who mainly concern us today, 1501 to 1598, so the 16th century, and then another Churchid, but not Shebanid branch, the Turay Timurid, sometimes better known as Astarkhanids or Janids, from 1598. It's confusing, and it's important that it is confusing. It's not just a duel between two very clearly defined sides. So, Safavid-Uzbek relations were not straightforward bilateral relations, you might call that in modern terms, but involved a complex interaction or sets of interactions between several players. This point is sometimes neglected in the discussion of Safavid-Uzbek relations. In the second Safavid century, at least the Safavid part in this multipolar geopolitical microcosm was reasonably coherent, we could say. It was the political structures and realities of the Neo-Chinggizid Churchid clans here that rendered the situation highly complex. There was not one single Uzbek counterpart. Most obviously, as early as 1510, there's a split among the Shebanids, with Khwarezm and the eastern parts in two different branches. Then we have the Turay Timurid successors in the 17th century, who faced very resourceful and active opponents in Khwarezmian rulers like Abul Ghazi Bahadur Khan and his son Anusha Muhammad, who need not concern us too much here. These tensions were not only the simple outcome of inter-clan or internecine competition, but had economic implications. Khwarezm and Bukhara competed for the control of important trade routes on which goods were transported between Iran, India, Central Asia, and Russia, and for most of the 17th century, still also China. Another aspect here is that the Eastern Uzbek or Neo-Chinggizid domains continue to be fraught by structural internal tensions. Although the situation became a little less complicated after in the 1580s, there's still the Neo-Chinggizid political structures were characterized by a quite strong regionalism, and at some occasions the inherent tensions led to open splits, to an actual division into separate khanates, especially two with centers at Bukhara and Balkh, and who during several periods during the 17th century were really two separate political entities and then were reunited again. And even when there was no such split, there were quite strong competing claims between different branches and factions among the Uzbek or Neo-Chinggizid states. And as Christina Nalli-Karimi puts it in her fine book, The Pearl in Its Midst, a book about the history of Herat and Khorasan in the early modern period, from 1611 on, I quote, "The power struggle between those factions provided the opportunity for Safavid intervention." We'll encounter some aspects of these interventions when we look at the Chehel Sutun paintings a little further on. These interventions were not limited to direct military intervention or interference of the Safavids or their governors, whatever, in the region. but extended, for example, to hosting Togay Timurid or Arab Shahid princes, so from Bukhara or from Khwarezm, when they were in trouble, providing them with serious resources. For example, Abul Ghazi Khan, who then became the famous Khan, Arab Shahid Khan of Khwarezm after 1644. Before that, he had spent 10 years at the court in Isfahan. A certain Rustam Muhammad Khan, little known but very important, he was at a certain point awarded to Yul, so some sort of tax grants in Save in western Iran, and sort of settled there with his Uzbek followers. So these are very substantial interactions here. So the circumstances that I tried, the political circumstances that I tried to outline here with almost reckless brevity, offered many openings for the Safavids, but also for their northeastern neighbors, so the Uzbeks or Neo-Chingisid, to directly intervene and attempt to obtain support and benefits. And it goes sometimes both ways. So, with that background, I want to ask the question, whose legacy is Timurid Khorasan? Because that was behind much of these conflicts. The claim to inheritance of Timurid Khorasan, so we should not forget that Herat in the final period of the Timurids was really the political and cultural center, and it was also, so that's what we're talking here about. The claim to inheritance to Timurid Khorasan was perhaps easier to make for the Abul Khairids, so for the, let's call them Uzbeks, it's easier. They had conquered the Timurid heartland. Remember, 1507, they were the first in Herat. Ismail Safavi came only 3 years later. And in many respects, their state was a continuation of the Timurid Empire. But the question to which extent, and if consciously or not, the Abul Khairids or Uzbeks saw themselves not just as Chingizids, but also in the Timurid tradition, is complicated. The Abul Khairid takeover of Central Asia from the Timurids in the early 1500s amounted to a restoration of the Chingizid mandate, as Robert McChesney has called it aptly. And he also coined the term Neo-Chingizid. But the foregrounding of the Chingizid aspect, as valid and important as it is, may have obscured some aspects of resilience of Timurid legacy. It is legitimate to ask, was the Abul Khairid state mainly Neo-Chingizid, or did it also have a post- or Neo-Timurid aspect? So here, very briefly, Muhammad Shibani Khan's relation to the Timurid imperial heritage is very ambiguous. His quite different policies and attitudes, for example, the conquest of Samarkand, where he first tries to eliminate the Timurid elites, while in Herat he sort of adopts a publicly, in the sense, ostentiously, a Timurid court culture. But Timurid credentials, especially connected with the possession of Samarkand or with military action in Khorasan, gained great importance in the intra-Abul Khairid conflicts after the death of Muhammad Shibani Khan in 1510. The Chronicle Zubdat ul-Asar, which was written in or shortly after 1525 in Chagatai, Turkey, for the ruler of Tashkent, for example, presents a double genealogy for the Abul Khairids. I quote, "The sultans of the Turks," that's the Shaybanids, "are from 2 Sahib Qirans." So you get even 2 from me, not only 1. Are from 2 Sahib Qirans. One is Genghis Khan and the other is Timur Beg. End quote. Thus, by the first quarter of the 16th century, the Abulkhayrids had developed a strong emphasis on the double Chingisid-Timurid heritage. A strong notion of Timurid legacy and entitlement became framed in a neo-Chingisid model of Turco-Mongol corporate kingship. This background is important in order to put arguments in perspective that were made in an exchange of letters between the Safavid Shah Abbas I and his Abulkhayrid opponent Abdul Mu'min to buttress claims to Khorasan by either side. These letters have been carefully studied by Audrey Burton in an article published in 1995. I will not repeat her detailed analysis, but only comment briefly on one of the arguments that was brought forth very early in the affair. Abdul Mu'min, the Abulkhayrid or Uzbek Sultan of Balkh, on behalf of his father Khan Abdullah II, responded to Shah Abbas, who had written. This happens when Shah Abbas starts making serious attempts to reconquer Khorasan in the early 1590s, and he writes a very angry letter to Abdullah Khan, who is the Khan, and the nephew of Abdullah Khan, Abdul Mu'min, who is kind of the regional sultan only, responds. It's interesting that Abbas doesn't really seem to mind that. He doesn't get a response from the Khan. He continues to communicate with the nephew as if he was equal. Anyway, so we have this response from Abdul Mu'min, who proposes a peace settlement, and says, well, let's just fall back on the agreement between the Timurid Hossein Baykara and the Akkoyunlu ruler Uzun Hasan, who, after all, is your ancestor. So 15th century, and this agreement was, of course, not acceptable because it would have put the border even west of Astarabad, so even more than the Uzbeks had occupied at that, or were in possession of at this point. So this is flatly denied by Abbas I, and he argues that the Abulkhayrids were by no means the heirs of Timur. But as we have seen, the Abulkhayrid claim to the Timurid legacy could not so easily be dismissed. It had its roots not just in the attempt to justify the possession of Khorasan, but had different origins, various origins, and was by the time of Abbas I deeply rooted in Abulkhayrid lore, political lore, bolstered by actual genealogical ties with the Timurids through the female line, which carried much weight in the Abulkhayrid context. So Abbas tried to turn the table and bring a more recent treaty into the picture. This agreement, he says, was signed in the second quarter of the 16th century by his grandfather, Shah Tahmasp, and Abdul Mu'min's granduncles, Kistin Kara Sultan and Pir Muhammad Sultan. And it is said to have divided the respective claims along the Amudarya River, or Oxus, giving Transoxiana to the Abulkhayrids and Khorasan to the Safavids. There is no evidence so far that I'm aware of that this agreement is ever signed. As Audrey Burton has pointed out, it's also quite unlikely, because if we look at the names here mentioned, it's quite unlikely that that they could have signed such an agreement. So we have to consider the possibility that the Shah simply made a bold claim to counter the dangerous Timurid argument of Abdul Mu'min. The Timurid card was not the only one played by the Abulkhayrids. In the light of the development of Chingisid-Safavid relations after 1500, an old mytho-geographical tradition gained new significance. This goes back to the pre-Mughal period efforts to write Iranian history in a larger Islamic narrative of universal history. So the regions of Iran are personified and are integrated into the genealogy of the prophets. And this becomes also quite popular in the Timurid period. So Noah's son Sam has two grandsons, two brothers, Khorasan and Haytal. Khorasan is the lord. South of the Oxus, Haital is the one, so the Heftalites actually is behind that, north of the Oxus. You find this in Hafiz Abrus Tarikh, in Yazdi's Zafarnameh, and other sources. And so this is taken up again in a universal chronicle written in Bukhara in 1539 or 40, so at the very end of the first phase of open hostilities over Khorasan. In the Tarikh Abul Khair Khani. So here the genealogical scheme is quite condensed, but it has a significant twist, which you still have to trace in the other sources. It's not everywhere, but here it's not only that Khorasan and Haital are brothers, but Iraq, and intended as Western Iran, is the son of Khorasan. So this implies a father-son hierarchy among the Safavids, who are the sons, the rulers of Iraq, and the Abul Khairids as heirs to Khorasan and Haital. So in the context of, there are others, and I will skip that, there are other interesting things like a Neo-Samanid narrative that pops up here, but I'm not going to go into this today. So with this, I come to the final section of my presentation, and we return finally to the Uzbek wallpapers at Chel Sutun. So we have looked at the story from the Uzbek, or rather Abul Khairid side and Togay Timurid side, and their relation to Timurid narratives. Let us now turn to the Safavid side and take a glimpse in the little remaining time I have to the wall paintings in the Chel Sutun pavilion, to which I referred in the beginning. In her seminal paper, Shah Abbas II, The Conquest of Kandahar, the Chel Sutun and its wall paintings, published in 1994, Susan Babai describes the Chel Sutun as, I quote, an eloquent testimony that the court set out to create an artistic and architectural backdrop to express the Safavid dynasties image in the arena of international politics and the court's own values. And she continues, the battle and reception scenes in the audience hall distill Shah Abbas II's dynastic vision of power and prestige in relation to his eastern neighbors. End quote. Babai concludes with this assessment, she concludes with that a convincing argument on the dating and identification of the wall paintings in the audience hall of Chel Sutun. So just very briefly, she dates them, the building to 1647 in one construction phase, and the paintings to about that period, and not very long after, so not in the 1660s. I know there is a whole debate around that. I find it quite convincing, and I will take this here. So she interpreted, she argued that the four paintings are connected by a common program, and interpreted them in the context of Shah Abbas's Eastern politics, especially the reconquest of Kandahar, which had been lost to the Mughals in 1638, so the same year Baghdad had to be ceded to the Ottomans. So there are two scenes that are relatively easy to identify. In the top row is Ismail I, who kills Muhammad Shebani Khan, the founder of the Shebanid Uzbek state, in battle in 1510. And the other one is Tahmasp and Humayun, apparently in the period when Humayun spent in exile at the Safavid court. Mughal connection here. Where am I here? Yes. So the third one is most likely represents on the bottom left corner a reception of Shah Abbas I for the briefly exiled Togay Timurid Khan Wali Muhammad in 1611, and the fourth, the bottom right side, depicts a reception presided over probably by Abbas II, but his guests are not easily identifiable as in the other paintings. Has been suggested, and Susan Babai suggested as well, Nader Muhammad Khan, and who also had to seek refuge briefly at the court in Esfahan in 1646, so just a year before Chelsedun was built, and it would thus be a parallel scene to the reception of Nader Muhammad's uncle Wali Muhammad Khan by Abbas I. So the top-bottom would then be very, very similar in meaning and content. So this identification is convincing, but the issue appears to be a little more complicated. One actually is the fact that the Safavid support for the refugee Khans was not very successful in either case. They returned to Central Asia and were either killed immediately or had big trouble, so this was not actually a very good case to be made for how important Safavid support was for how they were as kingmakers in Central Asia. But we get a good spin on that story by Iskandar Munshi, who else, whose narrative actually almost reads like an instruction to the painter for the bottom left painting. So he explains why Wali Muhammad Khan was not successful when he returned, and it was of course all his fault and not the Uzbeks. And he puts a quote in the mouth of Wali Muhammad, saying, I quote from, I cite from Roger Savory's translation, quote, "Up till now, every Uzbek and Chagatai prince who has sought help from the Safavid house has achieved his ends. My object in coming here was that my affairs might prosper when I come here and my resolve be strengthened." So this is what he supposedly says, but the outcome was actually quite different. What is more important, I think, is that there are really interesting differences between the two scenes. Now let me see if I got this. No, I need to go. I'm sorry, it's a bit small, but you may still see that. Bottom left, this is Abbas I, Wali Muhammad. The rulers appear more or less on the same level. They are all armed. They wear arms, weapons. And the Khan is surrounded by an Uzbek entourage. We can identify them by their mustaches and their turbans. It's very different in the bottom right image. And I now show this in a little bigger. The symmetry of the central composition is broken by the presence of someone who, it's always difficult to say who is who, but on the right-hand side, the man in white, I believe, is the Khan. To his right is probably a Safavid court official who we might also identify in other paintings. He does not bear any weapons, the Khan, and there's only one other Uzbek, the young man to his left, who also bears no weapons, and he's clad in this striking white robe, and he has a very strange gaze. He looks down. He doesn't look at the Khan, the person in white, anywhere. So very hypothetically, I propose that there is a kind of interference between representations of the reception for Nader Muhammad Khan and for Imam Quli Khan a few years earlier, who came through actually to Ghazvin as a pilgrim. And he had abdicated because he had become blind, and made a pilgrimage like many other, at least three other Khans in the 17th century as well. And so you see him here gazing into nowhere. This is the court eunuch, I believe, that's who I believe would be the Khan, either or Nader or Imam Quli or both. And just compare this very tentatively with the one portrait we have of Imam Quli Khan when he was in Ghazvin by Muhammad Musawwir, which very clearly shows him as a person who does not see well. So this would add another aspect to the messages implied in the visual program of the four painting. They may be less strictly connected to specific events, but convey broader notions than power and prestige. They represent a genealogy of Safavid royalty from the perspective of Shah Abbas. So we have Ismail Tahmasp Abbas I, and then himself. It's quite interesting who is highlighted here, highlighting different aspects. Military prowess of the founder. The second, perhaps, Tahmasp establishing Iran as an equal power among the major powers of the area. Shah Abbas, who secured hegemony over through the reconquest of Khorasan, here shown as hosting the Uzbek refugee, and finally Abbas himself, who builds up on this, but may also add aspects such as being a protector of pilgrims, etc. So some notion that might be implied here as well. So the last word on unpacking the meaning of these paintings has definitely not been said. I'm not even sure this is going to make it into any potential publishable paper, but I wanted to put it out here. So in lieu of a conclusion, there are, of course, many aspects of Safavid-Uzbek relations that would have deserved attention. There is the interaction of literati and circulation of knowledge studied brilliantly, for example, by Robert McChesney, by Maria Chopé. Have to refer you to Robert McChesney's brilliant article, The Barrier of Heterodoxy, published in 1996 in the Safavid Studies volume. Another aspect I have not have time to speak about is looking at Mashhad not just as a town that or city that changes sides, but a very ambiguous place with many meanings, a place in between in its own right. And what I try to argue today is that even on the political level, so not just on the cultural level, as McChesney and Chopé have argued, but also on the political level, the Safavid and Uzbek polities were much more closely interconnected, even in the 17th century, than the rhetoric of the chronicle suggests. The complex relations between the two realms cannot be reduced to dichotomies of creed, Sunni Shi'i, Uzbek Qizilbash, or conflicting interests and claims in Khorasan, but play out on many levels and in many shades of ideological, political, artistic, religious, intellectual, social, and economic interactions, in which moments of strong tensions alternated with quite peaceful phases and intensive encounters. The full range and implications of these for the understanding of the idea of Iran remain an interesting field of further inquiry. I will conclude with a short quote from Abbas I's chronicler, Iskandar Bek Munshi. I sometimes like to refer to him as the Shah's press secretary, Iskandar Hakabek Munshi. So, quote, although Uzbek affairs may be thought to have no place in a history of Iran, since they are relevant to my theme, I have no choice but to record them. So this is to all Safavid historians, please record also the Uzbeks. Thank you.
I think we've had a day and a half of very stimulating papers. I hope you agree. We have covered quite a few elements. Perhaps religion has come into it sort of vicariously, in a sense. I mean, we started off with seeing how Shiism became rather attached to the idea of being Iranian simply because it was described in Persian, which was a big help. It helped to spread religion, the Shiite religion, among the Iranian population because they could at last read about it. And of course, the precedents of this go back a very long way. I mean, the tafsir of Tabari, we know at the Salmanid court, had this fatwa from the local ulama that it was okay to translate the Quran into Arabic, into Persian, because this was the language that everybody spoke in the region. So this is a very long pedigree, this idea of appropriating something foreign by translating and, of course, modifying it as well. But then it's sort of run as a theme that, of course, particularly in this period, when Iran becomes a confessionally Shiite country officially for the first time, we see it running through everything. It's the identity of travelers. They see themselves as Shias against non-Shi when they travel on pilgrimage, even when it's supposed to be a coming together of the Muslims. We see it in the poets who sometimes refer to their identity as being Shi, or sometimes it's being Khorasani or whatever it is, but it becomes inextricably mixed. But of course it takes a long time. And as we've just heard, I mean, in the early period of confrontations across Transoxania and Khorasan, I mean, these boundaries are very, very flexible. We know perfectly well that Shah Rukh, even in the Timurid period, was a big patron of the shrine in Mashhad. We know perfectly well that these Uzbek Khans were the same. They didn't go to Mashhad to beat it up. They went there because they wanted to be associated with the charisma of the shrine and the imam and so on. So I think this period is one where slowly things that had been perhaps the common heritage of the whole region do slowly get crystallized, despite the fact that you have multiple sources of identity. In the end, of course, by the end of it, we do have an Iranian realm with rather specific borders for the first time, with a very solid identification with Shiite faith, which does mark it off from its neighbors, even if that doesn't actually affect anything, like trade or going on pilgrimage. But it is something that's very definitely associated with being Iranian, which is obviously grows in strength as the centuries thereafter evolve. I think we've also seen in the realm of art that the sort of focus on the landscape, the focus on the built landscape, and the what you could call the rural landscape or the pastoral landscape, the flowers and the gardens, is something that seems to be very much associated with a vision of living on the Iranian plateau, whether in a built environment or a rural environment. There's a very clear sense of what that is, how you would reflect it in painting or in architecture. You know, the buildings are built there to support a lifestyle, as Suzanne said, and they're also built of materials that are harmonious with the environment, and they're fulfilling cultural and religious needs, which are very specific to the place where they're built or painted. So I don't want to warble on for hours. I thought the idea of a discussion might be that other people want to chip in with reactions to. This is the end of the Safavid period, really. I think our next conference, all being well, up here and down there, will be moving on into the late 18th century and the transition to the Qajars. So have we left important things out, do you think? Are there areas that haven't been touched on? I know Fatima is very keen on the Armenians getting their proper share at the table. They're an important part of the history of Iran, of course, in the Safavid period, but maybe not so fantastically influential in terms of the perception of Iran. Anyone like to bail me out with a helpful comment from the floor? Just if I think this or I don't think that, or otherwise we can all disappear. It'd be really nice. Okay, good. Thank you. I'm on my own up here. So thank you very much for coming. It's been a beautiful Sunday morning, and thank you for your attention.